This video was brought to you by a very generous supporter on Patreon. Steamboy is a very unique film. How many other movies can boast of being on the crafting bench for 10 years and, at the time, be one of the most expensive Japanese anime films ever produced? Topping all that off, director Katsuhiro Otomo previously made one of the most legendary anime films ever, Akira. So what went wrong? It's certainly difficult 15 years later to get to the bottom of this production enigma, as my surface level research didn't grant me a great deal of sources. What I think would benefit you, dear viewer, is an assessment of the quality of the film as it stands today. This video will be analysing and critiquing one of anime's greatest financial flops, and we will see if the derision was justified or not. Let me take a little step back here for a second and just say that I've known about this film since childhood. It hasn't just popped into existence for me like Kill la Kill did. My father gifted me the DVD back when I was a Steamboy myself, but I believe I only watched it once and the memory was thrown into the deep dark recesses of my subconscious. I have an inkling of nostalgia for it in two regards. The first is the ominous appearance of the father character Eddie, practically a cyborg with only patches of hair remaining, voiced brilliantly by Alfred Molina. I don't think they could have picked a better actor considering possibly his most famous role as Dr. Octavius in Spider-Man 2 was only a year prior to Steamboy. The second string of nostalgia I have towards this film was from the initial chase sequence with Ray riding his wooden steam wheel. This scene stuck in my head for good reason. It's a thrilling and absolutely mind-boggling sequence because of risk. Ray's untested wheel of fortune is his only option of escape from the O'Hara Foundation's goons, who are also armed with their own, rather revolutionary for its time contraption. Their suitability for the future is evidently limited. One requires the user to be motion sickness resistant, and the other is unpredictably destructive. Both these initial aspects enhance this idea of risk to a stunning degree. Not to mention, this is a motif that runs throughout the film between the grandfather Lloyd and the father Eddie. A horse and cart is trampled on by the machinery, a perfect moment to capture this thematic idea of scientific progress. The pair find themselves running parallel to a train, and our protagonist is literally caught in between private and public industry, another idea foreshadowed by this amazing action sequence.
That boy needs help!
That boy needs therapy.
What is apparent though is that there was good intention for the movie artistically and thematically. The backdrops are supremely detailed, the skies are truly beautiful to behold, even the drawings of drawings look grand. The characters' movements and expressions additionally give this layer of immersion that your average anime just simply would not have. If we look at the moment when Ray is followed by three bullies, for example, he uniquely counters them by whacking the leader on the back of the head, and after his two friends run off, we have this wonderful response to the final insult, with Ray landing a final blow on his aggravator, and the film cuts to a log on a fire snapping in two. This seems more an ode to filmmaking in general, but it also provokes the idea of disdain towards having radical ideas from the populace. Unfortunately, there are a few moments where the animation definitely feels 15 years old. Take some of the 3D camera movements that feel quite bumpy alongside 2D drawn images, and some ground textures haven't aged particularly well either. Going into the third act as well, you can tell this film was directed by the same guy as Akira. The rising of the steam castle definitely didn't feel as earned story-wise, but you do have to admire the quality of drawings and animation that went into such an ambitious vision, right down to the fairground rides that pop up unexpectedly towards the end. Unfortunately, the film is fairly lacking in terms of story and characters. Understandably, the film's period of hiatus due to financial difficulties would stunt coherence in direction, but let's take one aspect that was left unexplored, which pops up from the opening scene, that of Russian America. It's quite an impressive sequence to set up the film visually, as reflections play a key part throughout it. This motif asserts that we should take a good look at ourselves before we take great strides for the sake of progress. The Crystal Palace that is depicted in this film is a prime example of this too, if a little historically inaccurate. Incredibly too, there's not not a single piece of music heard until after the title card is shown. The problem for me, however, is that by placing this title card here and then having the remainder of the film set in England, I would have expected this faction or country or nation or whatever to have had more of a profound influence over the narrative as a whole. All the Americans sound typically American too, and there's one character who might have had a Russian accent. Speaking of accents though, Anna Paquin's Mancunian accent is distractingly bad. Don't get me wrong, I find imitating Chris Eccleston's accent terrifically hard too, but sadly there's just no consistency to her performance. Stewart and Melina managed to pull it off fine, but I think the main issue lies in the characters more than the performers. Although the battle between idealism and pragmatism makes for a nice discussion at a debating club, it makes one want to claw their eyes out every time Lloyd and Eddie bump into each other seemingly by magnetic attraction in the second and third act.
This is no time for your annoying philosophies!
It's difficult to assess whether their dialogue comes as a result of bad translation or hindsight, but every time Eddie mentioned science, it felt like he'd been indoctrinated by some invisible entity. This lack of a pseudo-emperor character does work to the film's advantage though, as there is no true antagonist pulling the strings behind the scenes. The first time the movie started rubbing me up the wrong way though was when Ray was sitting in the cabin with Robert Stevenson and his blonde associate. Before we're given the chance to breathe after that wonderful chase sequence, suddenly this blimp comes along and kidnaps Ray so he and the MacGuffin can be at the right place at the right time. We're then introduced to Scarlett, an obvious nod to Gone with the Wind, who just annoyed me to no end. I understand that's exactly her purpose in the film, but her relationship with all the characters bar one feels really forced. I didn't find the relationship between herself and Ray to be believable, and there was even a point where Eddie and her were just talking simultaneously.
I already have 2 hot air balloons with my name on the sides, and my grandfather owns a Zeppelin.
Quit your prattling for 1 minute,
How
girl!
dare you! I don't prattle!
I'm not sure if this is a mistranslation of humor, but I just found it straight up weird. The one character who I did like seeing her interact with was the executive director named Simon. This guy's never-ending eagerness to sell O'Hara products was fantastic, especially when the violence started ramping up towards the end of the film and still had to put a face on for the world's military leaders.
What's going on down there? Are we fighting someone?
It's just a little war with Great Britain. And if you purchase all 3 together, there's a 25% discount.
He can make a good sales pitch, but his discounts certainly aren't as good as Steam's. It would have been nice had Ray not simply reacted to everything that was going on and been the carrier of the film's MacGuffin. There was a nice moment when he handed the steam ball over to the British, who rather cruelly deceived him into handing it over by suggesting that science makes people happy. It's almost like they knew his father was obsessed with science's potential.
Mr. Stevenson did research with your father. They were colleagues for more than 20 years.
Colleagues we were, but it might be more accurate to call us rivals. Both studied steam power in America back in 1839.
The film toys with the idea of indoctrination too, as both children are made confused by the promises of adults. Scarlett has a conversation with Dr. Lloyd before he's re-imprisoned, who spouts out this idea about war profiteering.
The Foundation is abusing science, building monstrous weapons of war.
What's wrong with that? Every country has weapons. We make lots of money with them, and why shouldn't we?
Evidently, this wasn't an idea she herself conjured up, as she soon sees for herself the damage her company's produce can be. It's certainly fitting too that these children will see the world tumble into the madness of 2 world wars without explicitly showing us clips of warfare or something cliche like that. There's plenty of that going on in this demonstration though. I loved the look of these steam soldiers too. That was a nice creative decision. It was a little strange though how willingly certain adults would shoot children with guns and cannons. Like something from 2013's Gravity, Ray flies his way up to the castle in the sky. Wait, didn't Ghibli come up with that idea in the 80s? There was a nice connection between the grandfather moping about the hearts of men and then proceeding to shoot his own son, seemingly done in typical parental guidance fashion.
The flesh is weak, it tears quite easily. Metal, on the other hand, is hard to damage and easy to repair.
Oh. Well, that just makes it even worse. Convenience and pandering. Even after being shot, Eddie is just absolutely fine with his almost murderer standing there and continuing to ruin all that hard work he put into it.
Let's do this together like we used to. Hey, Father?
Is destroying cities a hobby for you two? Annoyingly, the solution to moving the castle back over the Thames is just to pull levers and turn valves. Now that might seem fairly obvious for a film centered around steam, but I felt like this solution was not adopted in a very interesting way. Roll back the movie to the very first scene with Ray and you'll find him doing exactly the same thing, averting a crisis by pulling levers and turning valves.
The rest is all built upon this. It's the very core of the steam castle.
And there's the main boiler.
The moment I pull this lever, the pressure will vent and the tower will begin to drop. That is the crucial moment.
These characters are not talking as expert mechanics, but as though somebody, i.e. the audience, needs to be informed as to what's going on here. It really breaks the immersion that was built up throughout the earlier parts of the film by giving all these characters expository dialogue. The two child characters then got more and more excited and by extension more unbearable to listen to.
What now, Ray? Huh? How do we get out of here? There has to be a way!
Grandfather, the lift's broken. There's no way to go down and the flying machine's all out of steam. What in the world can we do? I can't leave you. We're in this together. If we
Stop wasting time, would you? If you don't hurry, we're all going to die!
No, wait!
Just as the pair find their escape hatch, this is where the film gives off its unfinished impression the most. Don't get me wrong, I loved their final lines with the ominous thunderclouds approaching, a nod to the horrors that await in the 20th century. It's when you see things like Ray suddenly changing clothes in a matter of seconds, countless explosions, and everybody in London suddenly turning into children? And the ice?
It's all frozen.
No shit, Sherlock. I'm not going to pretend to understand what's going on or question how an explosion turned into ice, but it's just so excessive that by the end you just find yourself worn down by how Michael Bay it became. Yes, it's unfair of me to compare the two, seeing as Transformers wasn't even a thing until 3 years after this, but I think Roger Ebert summed it up best in his review of this film. It's a theory of mine that action does not equal interest. Objects endlessly in motion are as repetitive as objects forever at rest. Context is everything. Why are they moving? Who wants them to move? What is at risk? What will be gained? By the end of Steamboy, I was convinced the answers to all of these questions were: Otomo has abandoned the story and, in despair, is filled the screen with wonderfully executed but pointless and repetitive kinetic energy. I don't wholeheartedly agree with the abandonment of the story comment, it's just that the strain of working on a project for far too long, let alone 10 years, would make one forget why they were making the film in the first place. And that just about wraps up my thoughts on the whole thing. Let's have a little conclusion, shall we? So, did it suck? Not entirely, and I'm willing to forgive the film for its shaky plot with the understanding of the context regarding the film's production, of which I understand very little, but you can tell it had a lot of heart and soul poured into it. Also, something I neglected to mention was the rise of CGI at this point in time. At the end of the 20th century, CGI wasn't really something that was adapted as well as we know it today. Toy Story wasn't even 10 years old at this point. Although some shots look dated for 2020 standards, the film can still blow the mind with drawings alone. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of narrative to hold the whole thing together, and I'm not exactly aching to watch it again anytime soon. I'd sooner point people in the direction of Akira, which took nearly as long to make and is slightly more enjoyable than this film. I give Steamboy a 5 out of 10. Thanks for watching. Have you seen Steamboy? If so, what do you think? Leave a comment below or join us for a chinwag on my Discord server, where we'll continue this discussion.